I got home from Sicily last night at past midnight, so Lord knows how my filter's going to do. We'll just ride it and see. So, we have come to Unit 8. You will notice Unit 7 we are skipping. If we have enough time, we'll circle back for Roman law, but needs must. So, before break, Greek medicine came to Rome. Today we are going to beat Galen, who is the last author in our timeline and a spicy fan favorite, so brace yourself. The reading and content for this unit includes, so there's a backup recording of the older lecture, slides. So the reading I'm having you do is Galen's On Prognosis, which you may recognize from Hippocratic on Prognosis's title. It's a deliberate callback. However, if you expect Galen to give you clear and useful directions on how to tell if your patient is going to die, it is not that. He instead is going to tell you a series of stories about himself where he is the smartest guy in the room. This is the Galen experience. I'm also having you read Maud Gleason's Shock and Awe. This is a modern article about Galen's dissections as performance art. So that exists. There's a bonus reading if you haven't had enough of Galen. This survives only in the Arabic, so this is an English translation from the Arabic on examinations by which the best physicians are known. Spoiler, the best physician is Galen, and you find out if you have the best physician by looking to see if it is Galen. So after you are done with this, there's a Roman medicine quiz, which I've removed the malpractice law material from. The study guide is here. And then the midterm is coming up. I'm planning 2 weeks from now. Standard extension policies apply. So if you have not caught up on your quizzes, do work on that. But Mercy and extensions are available on demand. It is always best to do it late than not do it at all. Alrighty. Yes. Sorry.
Excuse me, are you going to release a study guide for the midterm?
Oh, yes. So the midterm study guide should... Let's see. So the midterm itself is hidden, but the study guide is here. Yeah.
Under Unit 7?
If you keep scrolling past Unit 8, it'll be right there where it says midterm study guide under the Roman medicine quiz. So it's not signposted well. I need to figure out how to make these fancy colors so they stand out better. Yeah, good question. Any other housekeeping stuff before we move into the content? All right, my folks. So, I should turn on the projector. I swear, I'm not new. Well. Here we are. Projector, come on. There we go. Why are none of the images showing? That is unusual. What? Huh. One moment. Okay. All right, well, they're on here. So the HDMI on, source, laptop HDMI check, display blinking ominously. Huh. Okay, let's try this again. Tammy news. Okay, it is there. It is working. We do not need to panic right exactly now. However, we do need to reset the window. And we're doing that. Yay. Okay. So a quick orientation to where we are in the readings. The deleted scene, the digestive Roman law, is at the bottom in parentheses. So we have read Cato the Elder's on agriculture. He is the cabbage guy. You may remember him. We have not yet read Celsus. He's an upcoming scene when we get to surgery and also diet and exercise, but I've put him on the timeline of Roman authors, so he's on a slide that's easy to study. Pliny the Elder, so far you've just read a bit of book 29, where he gives you a thumbnail summary of how Greek medicine came to Rome. He's the fellow who tells us about Archagathus and his doomed practice. Archagathus, you may recall by his snappy nickname, the Butcher. That didn't go well. So we are here at the end of our timeline, except for our legal sources. Galen of Pergamon. Pergamon, you may recall as being the place where Nicander of Colophon wrote his poetry before Pergamon was given to Rome in Attalus III's will, and Nicander, we think, moved to Rome for the last few years of his life. So this is that Pergamon, where Attalus was having dinner parties and threatening his friends with poison poems. This is 200 years later. It's still a Greek-speaking part of modern-day Turkey, and Galen was born there into a wealthy family of non-doctors. And he tells us so. He is our source for this. We cannot verify, but after a childhood illness, he vowed to Asclepius that he would dedicate his life to medicine, and he did dedicate his life to medicine. I will give him that. For all I'm going to take pot shots at this guy because of his abrasive personality, he was a very well-educated, authoritative, and eager physician, for good and for ill. There's also, this bust is frequently misidentified as Cato the Elder, so I've given him to you so you can admire the internet's fan art of him as a cabbage. And if that is not funny, review the Cato the Elder reading, and it will be. Okay, let's meet Galen. I've subtitled our Galen intro lecture as shameless self-promotion, because if there is one thing that characterizes the tenor of this fellow's career and the reason why we have his written works, which is why he's so important to us, not just that he was a very successful physician, but that he was a prolific author whose works were considered valuable and therefore copied enough to make it to us through the bottleneck of the Middle Ages, and not just through one stream of information either. He survives in Latin translation in the West, in Greek original in the East, and also in Arab translation through universities in the Arab-speaking world through the Middle Ages. So we have a lot of this particular ancient person's writing. But there was a lot of it to preserve because he was a relentless self-promoter and self-publisher. And he seems to have built this into his practice by having enslaved secretaries who would take dictation when he was giving lectures and would collate and publish the results. So a lot of hidden labor goes into Galen's prolific publication career. So if you're beating yourself up for not writing as many textbooks as Galen, you have also not enslaved as many people as Galen. So feel good about this. That's a good thing. So Galen worked his way up from a provincial medical student. Being from a rich family in Pergamon in the Roman Empire was not as big a deal as when Pergamon was a standalone kingdom. So he went to medical school in Alexandria before returning to practice in Pergamon, working as the staff physician for the local gladiators. So he began as a sports medicine trauma surgeon. And if you've met trauma surgeons, there's a recognizable vibe that we can see with Galen. I say with great fondness because I owe trauma surgeons a lot of things and I'm quite fond of them, but it requires confidence to be one. And Galen, confidence is one of his characteristics. However, When he has graduated from his few years practicing for the gladiators of Pergamon, not quite for the gladiators, they're not who's hiring him. It is the wealthy people who are enslaving the gladiators and profiting off of their um, mortal combat in the arena. And it is they who are pleased enough with Galen that he's able to take this nest egg and move to the center of empire. That is Rome in the mid 100s CE. This is under a period of the empire. So, empires are ruling in Rome. It's a period of military stability within the empire, if not without. The borders are hairy, and plague is already beginning to threaten the edges of empire. But in the central Mediterranean core, things are functioning as well as they ever do. Galen's able to use that to take advantage of relatively safe travel and his family money, and comes to Rome and does what you need to do to build a practice, which is how we end up in this Renaissance era woodcut. This is fan art of Galen's On Prognosis. So the scene comes from the reading you're about to read. Galen, like many other physicians, used a culture of public lecture circuits and infotainment in the empire at large, and the capital is part of this culture, to promote himself and get clients. And to give you an idea of why we have this pig on a table and all of these fancy people surrounding it, you would invite the fanciest Romans you knew to your public dissection or often vivisection demos, which is exactly what it sounds like. Sometimes your animal dissection subjects are not dead when you begin, which is hard to sit with, and one of the things that I struggle with when reading Galen. These fancy Romans would come and expect to be educated by you, the anatomist physician, as you show them that you know the most about anatomy. But it's not just that, there's a bit of stand up performance art in this too. You would, at certain points, pause and start a medical emergency on your animal subject. Say, you would start bleeding and be like, "Who can stop the bleeding?" And then if you see another doctor in the audience, you'd be like, "You, Unimus, come stop the bleeding if you can." And when Eudemus, again, according to Galen, inevitably fails, Galen steps in at the last minute, stops the bleeding, and is like, "Huzzah, who is the superior physician?" Wow, it's a lot. So we call this the anatomical demonstration. Rather, Galen calls this an anatomical demonstration. And it's part of a larger intellectual culture in the Roman Empire that we'll dig into a little bit more. But what's important to know when you're reading On Prognosis is that some of the scenes happen at these open to the public medical shows where Galen is showing how good he is at animal anatomy. Animal because it was not socially or morally acceptable to do this to a human subject in public, thank goodness. Which is not to say that things like this did not happen. Again, this is home of the gladiators, the Roman Empire. There were some norms that limited public cadaver dissection, but it was not illegal. It was just considered tacky and a bit much. Yes.
How public is public? Could like a random
Yes.
slave walk in and see what's going on?
So when you begin, you might be on a street corner. As you work your way up, you might book a stadium where sometimes the admission is paid for the public by a fancy Roman who wants to be seen as a patron of the arts and sciences. Sometimes you charge a little bit of admission, but if you lived in the Roman Empire in a relatively urban area, this is the kind of thing that you would go to with the same casualness that we listen to podcasts or go to YouTube. And like, if you want to, you can find filmed surgery on YouTube. It's not everybody's taste, but I find it interesting. Yes.
Was it expensive? Like,
Not, it does not seem to have been too expensive to come, unless you're a doctor and Galen makes you do anatomy in front of an audience. But if you're very confident, that could work to your advantage if you beat Galen in an anatomy contest. So one of the, you'll notice their name tags on our fancy people. This dude, Boethus, is a consul who takes an interest in Galen's career in his early years in Rome and serves as one of his early patrons. And it's he and his family who invite Galen to the other face of public medical treatment in the Roman Empire. And this is the fancy patient's bedside. So you've been asking very good questions about like how easy was it to come to these public demonstrations? However, one of the ways that if you are a fancy or upwardly mobile rich Roman, could display your learning and your community spirit. And also, this was just socially a perk of being somebody's friend. If you were sick, you were expected to invite your friends to come hang out in your sick room and then watch your doctor's audition to be your doctor. So these were ostensibly private. But Galen's going to describe a few of these situations where he's called to a patient and he's one of several doctors on like a reality TV panel where they do a bit of a Hell's Kitchen episode, and then the patient will pick a doctor, but the other doctors stay there waiting for you to make a mistake so that they can swoop in. And they're standing back there second guessing. So, one of the reasons this is called on prognosis is Galen is going to tell some stories about times where he wasn't the first doctor picked. So, what he does is he stands on the side of the room and he says, the patient is going to have a fever spike in 2 hours. And there's a nosebleed coming in 5, 4, 3, 2. Oh, what are you going to do, doctor he picked? The stress of practicing medicine in this environment. If you find it off-putting that a patient has their phone out in WebMD, this must have been some next level professional angst-inducing nonsense. Okay, so one more thing I need to tell you about Galen to give you the flavor of this fellow and why you should stick it out doing this reading, because it is going to be wordy. I'm going to go with wordy and a bit challenging to get into. How many of you ever saw the show House?
Yeah.
Okay, that's him. Okay, we have the vibe now. And if not, just like pick a random episode, watch a few minutes of it. You'll get it. That's him. He is a challenging human being to be around. However, from what we can tell of his medical opinions, he is a good doctor. He's just a really abrasive, difficult human being and not the best colleague in the world. Even for his own students, there is some workplace toxicity here. So one way that can be helpful if you're struggling with the reading a bit, it's meant to be performed out loud. So you're reading what should be a stand-up show. Try reading it out loud. Your roommate will look at you funny, but maybe they'll get invested. You never know. Do the voices. And then you'll start to see the completely insane scenes that are coming out, including one involving Boethus' wife's uterus. Okay, I don't want to spoil it, but do brace yourself. Spoiler, Galen is always right. But remind me, who wrote this?
Galen.
Okay. So keep in mind, the narrator is unreliable. Was Galen truly this good? We may never know. However, he does eventually trade up from Boethus the senator to the highest ranking patient in the Roman Empire, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. If you've seen Gladiator 1, you've met Marcus, old emperor at the beginning. That's him. He was chronically ill his whole life, so really good job, but also very high stress job that Galen holds for years, which he must have been good at something. It is kind of interesting, though, because On Prognosis dates from a time before the emperor hires him, and there's this moment where he hears that there's a plague to the north, and he avoids meeting the then emperor, I think Lucius Verus, because he's worried that he might get drafted to go serve in the plague. and it's a moment. So do watch out for that. There's also a moment at the beginning where he's talking about what happened to one of his med school professors, a guy named Quintus. Very annoying name because it's just a first name and it's a really common first name. So it's like, oh, yes, my supervisor, Bob. It's not very specific. We do not know who Quintus is outside of Galen, but he says that his mentor got run out of town because he was so good at guessing what would happen with patients that he got accused of sorcery and had to leave abruptly. But this is also a subtle way for Galen to brag, to be like, yeah, if you follow my prognosis advice, you're going to get accused of sorcery. You'll be so good. Again, Dr. House is a great uh, model to keep in mind for this fellow. Okay, so let's meet the Roman Empire that Galen is doing his problematic but entertaining performance art medicine within. This is the empire at its greatest extent a little bit before Galen's time, 117 CE. Galen is born, I think, in the 140s or so, and he's active up until 215 to 218. 218 is our best guess for when Galen dies. Quite elderly, so he manages to stick around for a bit. Good for him. Maybe good for us, depending on how you feel about Galen. So, as I said, this is a time of relative stability, but not absolute safety. This is still an empire where you can get kidnapped, taken away from everyone you know and love, and then sold into slavery because nobody can vouch for your free status. Just to give you something to be anxious about should you ever choose to time travel. Don't. You will mess up the timeline. Please don't. Also, unsafe, and the pathogens are different. So don't think vaccines will save you if you don't have the right ones. Just saying. But if you do, wash your hands and go to North Africa. This right here is the most stable bit of the empire in this century. Hangs on really well. Carthage. I highly recommend ancient Carthage. That's my plan. So here in pink is our political heartland, but the empire extends to the green areas as well. Active armed war zones along here, the Rhine and Danube River valleys, going into Eastern Europe. Rome technically has all of the Black Sea margins under its control, but effectively it's the southernmost end of the Black Sea. Also, they have just gotten somewhat into Assyria and are nibbling away at the edges of Parthia. This is as far as they get. R.I.P. Dura Europus. So I mentioned this is a time where there is an outbreak of epidemic disease. And on this next slide, we are going to be looking at some pictures of patients with difficult diseases. But we're doing this for knowledge and so on. So let's talk about what disease this might be. I'm not going to give you any satisfying answers, but we are going to talk a little bit about why it's hard to figure out what pathogen goes with what historical pandemic the farther you get away in time. This is something that is currently under a lot of reconsideration because now we are better able to get a hold of not just ancient human DNA, but ancient pathogen DNA inside human remains, which has allowed us to detect strains of diseases that we did not think got to Europe as early as they did. I'm looking at you, Yersinia pestis. Under Justinian is the first outbreak of bubonic plague in Europe, and that is the 500 CE, so earlier than we thought. Also, the European end of bubonic plague outbreaks was the tip of a much bigger iceberg and were mild flares compared to what was going on in sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. So the European Middle Ages gets all of the thunder, but it's not the worst. That's sad. Also, the latest outbreak was in Edinburgh, and there was another one in San Francisco in the early 1900s. So not as old as you think either. Okay, so let's talk about the Antonine Plague. I did warn you there's some rashes, but for a good reason. For the longest time, we thought that this was measles. However, sequencing rather of the measles genome showed us that measles is not as old as we first thought. It crosses over from rinderpest, a cow disease, into a human disease, measles, around 900 CE, which is the first time it's clinically described in a recognizable way in the Jewish physician working in the I think he's in Baghdad when he does this, around 900 CE. So that date matches up really well. So there is no measles before that, and there should be less measles now than there is because the vaccine is very effective and the disease is a problem on a number of fronts. It causes immune amnesia and it can kill your reproductive tissue. So, standards vaccinate your children, please, especially for measles. Okay, so that was out of the way. About 10 years ago was when the science updated on this. And we're like, okay, so it's not measles. Well, dang. Um, the descriptions we get say that there is a rash, a bit of a spotty, speckly rash. So we thought, oh, surely measles. No. So then we're like, okay, smallpox. Gotta be smallpox. Except the lesions that we see that look a lot like smallpox on mummified bodies, we used to think that we had evidence of the smallpox we knew from the 17 and 1800s and 1900s until reliable vaccines and early vaccine. Rabbit hole. Over the rabbit hole. There we go. Resist. That strain of smallpox was an evolution of the underlying smallpox virus. The pathogen making people sick with smallpox like rashes in the pre modern world was a different strain of smallpox that is significantly different from the version that was current in the 1800s. That smallpox epidemic was much, 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 much more virulent than what's kicking around in its previous life. So while an earlier iteration of smallpox is still on the table for the Antonine Plague, it's not the smallpox. I'm sure that that made a huge difference to the people who had it. So we are back to square one with this. We have not figured it out yet, and we are still looking for bodies that we can tie to outbreaks well enough to look through the DNA to see if there are pathogen fragments that make sense as a cause of death. So watch this space. We may someday know what the Antonine Plague was. Suffice to say, though, many people were getting very sick, and though it begins in the encampments along the Rhine and Danube, the northern frontier, which is at the time the hottest ongoing war zone on the border of empire, as troops filter back to the core of the empire, as they do rather regularly, and officers come and go, the disease spread into the interior through the trade ports. So this was something that emperors are going to find increasingly climbing their list of things they need to solve to keep the empire from imploding. The next century, the 200s, we sometimes refer to as the crisis of the third century because they did not indeed manage to keep the lid on this. And the empire descends into a state of quick turnover in the emperor's seat. And this weird period where the governor of Britain declares Britain to be alt-Rome for a while, and then it's just Britain, Roman Empire too. But the emperor comes for him eventually, and RIP, independent Roman Britain. Back to the greater intellectual culture. I did mention I was going to bring this up as a frame for what's going on with Galen's performance art. So Galen's public demonstrations of anatomy and general lectures on various topics in medicine were part of a larger movement in Greek. So the language that people are performing in is Greek, even though they're going to Latin-speaking majority parts of the Roman Empire. At this point, Greek had become a sign that you were educated, that you could do Latin for government reasons, but you could also speak brilliantly in Greek. And if you were really good at this, you could pack a stadium for your public speaking demos alone. And often this is give you a sense of what this would be like, you'd have somebody who would pretend to be giving a famous speech from history and then pack a stadium for people to listen to this fake speech that a famous historical person might have given. For instance, if I gave a speech that was what, oh, Frederick Douglass may have said on the occasion of hearing about the Dred Scott decision, and then gave this completely original speech in the voice of Frederick Douglass, and people listened to me do this for 4 or 5 hours at a go, and then they all paid. That would be what is going on in the arena packing superstar world of the second sophistic, is what we call this period. So Galen was working in a niche market of medical infotainment that had a much bigger market share. And this seems to have been a kind of entertainment that was as popular as things we find more recognizable, like theater, musical performances, dance performances, musical theater, which is all of those. There were competitive festivals where you would get judged and you would get victory trophies, and you'd use this to build your profile. And the highest profile artists had beef with each other that were beefy enough that we still know about them. For instance, Elias Aristides, or sorry, no, it's Polemo and a guy named Favorinus. Favorinus was from modern France, Roman Gaul, so he did not grow up speaking Greek, and he also was born. We're not entirely sure what the condition was, but he self-identified as a eunuch. Today we might call him intersex. He went by he/him, so I'll use that. Uh, Polemo was a very if Rome knew about alpha males, he would identify as such, and they had this ongoing, not friendly competition with each other. But I'm rather fond of Favorinus's most famous comeback, where he's like, "Yeah, I'm a eunuch, but I got sued for adultery and won. So I may be a eunuch, but say hi to your wife for me." Oh. Well, Favorinus. That's probably not healthy either, but we admire the chutzpah. So Galen is not the only guy who's going around with this incredibly large ego. It's expected. It's part of what you're supposed to do to be a high-profile Hollywood podcaster, or whatever it is we're calling this. I shouldn't bring up Joe Rogan, but I'll just leave that here. That tactic, by the way, is a standard of technical rhetoric. It's called praeteritio. It's when you say you won't mention something and you've mentioned it. You can have that for later. Tell a friend. Within this environment, though, your star power was not the only thing that was guaranteeing you security, promotion, and advancement. All of these high-profile performers required, particularly if they were not born with Roman citizenship, some kind of formal sponsorship and support. Then, as in today, when you're in the arts, you need to hustle in order to afford what you're doing. And it may seem weird to have a conversation about funding the arts when we're talking about medicine, but medicine was considered among the arts a little bit, as well as it was a technical skill. And the way that you were supported and promoted through your career often looked pretty much the same. That is, if you begin as an enslaved person, you might be sent to med school or educated in-house if you were enslaved by a doctor, by your enslaver, who would then give you a rent-to-own situation, incentivizing your learning with the promise of freedom. But on freedom, you're expected to maintain a relationship with your former enslaver, who then becomes your patron. They sponsor you for Roman citizenship. If they decide you are ungrateful, that can be revoked. What seems to happen more in practice is they just don't feed you anymore and diss you in public. But that is not nothing, because everything that your career depends on in these high social circles is, who do you know? will they vouch for you? And how are your general reviews? So it's a little bit between Yelp reviews and word of mouth, this promotion structure. An intellectual named Lucian tells us that you can end up in this really difficult hustle culture where you desperately try to get to be a rich person's friend, and you end up being invited to go on road trips with them, but they'll make you like dog sit their not house trained lapdog, and they'll make you do chores for free, and you end up spending all of your time just doing whatever for this rich person on the hope that they'll help you fund your business. So the precariousness of this cannot be underestimated, but it informs what you're going to see Galen doing socially as he builds his practice. If he can name drop somebody's political rank, he will bring it up. So we may not know what Quintus, his last professor's full name is, but we do know that Boethius is a Roman senator of the senatorial class because Galen makes sure that we know that. When somebody is related to the emperor in any conceivable way, Galen will bring that up because that is how you socially network in the Roman Empire. And when he goes to a dinner party as an invited guest, it's not a social call, it's actually for work. He would be expected to give mini lectures about medicine in between banquet courses and maybe treat some of the guests for free. And some of the stories kind of start with a social visit that turns into impromptu healthcare. So, networking, schmoozing, and sucking up to the most important Roman you can possibly find is a big part of what your professional life may look like when you're building a medical practice in ancient Rome. Galen is unusually successful because he ends up working for the emperor. For most Roman physicians, though, you'd spend a lot of your time in LinkedIn purgatory, as it were, just hoping that nobody gives you a bad Yelp review. Okay, so who are doctors during this period in the Roman Empire? There's a real wide variety. I'm going to give you some terms for categories and specialties that are kicking around in the Latin tradition. Our word for a general practitioner, a physician, a doctor, just generic opening term in Latin is medici if you have a mixed gender group, medicae if we have just ladies. That's how gender works in Latin. Us if you're male, if you're female, and if you're in between, they usually default to the masculine again because it's that kind of language. So in general practice, we do see people of a bunch of different freedom statuses, a lot of different social and cultural backgrounds. But in Rome specifically, it seems to be the case that upper class people don't go into medicine. So if you are a senatorial class Roman and you have the temerity to practice medicine, your peers will pretend like you're not a real Roman. Pliny the Elder mentions this in passing, and I feel bad for these Romans sometimes. The assumption was if you practice medicine, you almost certainly aren't a full Roman. You're likely an immigrant and most likely Greek, to the point where sometimes we'll see physicians trying to look more Greek so they fit the expectation a bit more. But also, Greek speakers and Greek identifying people form one of the largest non-Roman groups in the Roman Empire just because of the way that colonization worked in the Mediterranean for the 4 centuries or so leading up to Roman expansion into the area. So a lot of places in the empire spoke Greek as a first language. Many more used Greek as a language to facilitate communication between many different local languages. For instance, in ancient Judea, you'd have to speak Greek because you had so many other language groups together in the same place. So not everybody whose name looks Greek and who speaks Greek is Greek, but to the Romans, it is close enough. However, one place where we do see a lot of people with more Roman presenting names is in people whose medical training happens in the context of military service. The Roman legion, in order to hold on to all of this territory generation after generation, had to become much more structured. And within that structure was a need for trained physicians to serve as administrators and high profile healthcare providers. But that's not enough doctors to treat the number of sick people in the legions. To do that, you need to tap people with talent and train them within their unit. This is where we see the beginning of what becomes medic corps. Um, Paramedics also get their start here. And then doctors who are trained in the context of their military service, which is still a way that you can get your medical training today. A lot of people begin their medical training when they're in the military. The military then pays for their med school, and then part of their service to the profession is done in the context of veterans. This begins in Rome. We are only going to run into one author who may have been a military medicus. We'll unpack that when we get to it. But a lot of the rank and file of doctors are coming through this territory, and we have a lot of their tombstones. There are also specialists, and I'm not listing them all here because there are a lot. These are mostly by body part, although some of them are by type of therapy. So we have surgeons who just do surgery. We have pharmacists who just compound and offer remedies. Often they prescribe as well, but they don't necessarily do house calls and general medicine. Then there are body part specialists, so eye specialists, ear specialists. Ocular surgery is one of the earliest mini like niche specialties. We'll get to that when we get to surgery. In the retail pharmacy world, you also had a lot of people who wouldn't identify as pharmacists acting as pharmacists. There's not nearly the level of control over pharmacy as a practice in this period, and a lot of it, because of the way pharmacy works, is semi-agrarian anyway, because many of the ingredients have to be sourced from plants and animals, and this requires having a good supply line and somebody's reputable who can say for sure whether a plant is still good or not and if it's the thing you actually bought. But this is a skill that you also need to sell dye or industrial products or cosmetics. So a lot of things get lumped into retail pharmacy that we would not recognize as pharmacy. However, they're also the reason why you can still buy makeup at the Walgreens. We haven't really separated the practice of pharmacy from cosmetic selling and greeting cards for some reason. Maybe that's where the pigments come in. At the top of this scale, in the bottom of this slide, we have the archiatry. So this is a Greek word that gets enshrined in Roman law. These are the officially recognized chief physicians of a community. Roman law put number quotas on how many you could have depending on how big your city was. And these were the people that you tapped to be your official city physicians. With that came some privileges. If you were an official city physician, you would not be expected to do the kinds of duties that other prominent citizens would do. For instance, you wouldn't have to quarter visiting dignitaries in your house, which was a thing that could happen in the ancient world. Is if the governor was visiting, he might end up in your guest room. But if you're a doctor, you are busy doing a service to the community. That means you don't have time to make fancy meals for the governor and let him sleep on your couch. So you got immunity from that. You'd also get certain tax privileges and protection of your salary bracket, which was nice. In some communities, we have various kinds of doctors ending up in this category. A lot of them, some of them rather, include medici, and I haven't mentioned obstetrices, but they're on the next slide. So OBGYNs. Sometimes it will be translated midwife. There isn't a difference between the two specialties in this period, so both are fine. Or, as I prefer to do it, you can just use the words that ancient people used for them. In Greek, Maiai or a Maia is a reproductive medicine specialist. And these are exclusively women, mostly treating women and very young children. So also they're neonatologists and young life pediatricians. So anything reproductive medicine adjacent, you're going to have a female practitioner. Although, when we get into urology, if you have a penis, your dude doctor can manage that. But if you're trying to reproduce, you might end up with a Maya or an obstetrics advising you on how to do that. Stay tuned, we're doing a unit. It's a wild ride. So, who are these practitioners and where do they fit in the pecking order is something that medical historians have recently been reconsidering, because in early years of medical history, our reflex was to see women practicing medicine for women and assume, oh, low status, not as important, not a real doctor, not quite. That does not describe what we see, however, when we look at the sources. Although this is a culture that deprivileges women and girls and limits their access to political power, within this specialty, people practicing this medicine, because it was women for women and there were norms prohibiting men from having close contact with the bodies of women who were quote unquote reputable. Their word, not mine. Everybody deserves respect, gosh darn it. But for people who were married with children, not sex workers, that's what they mean by this. It was considered inappropriate for a male doctor to get too close. So even if you hire a male doctor, they have to collaborate with the Maya or obstetrics. Obstetric is the word in Latin, it's where we get obstetrician from. That would be the person who's taking your vitals, observing your patient, applying your treatments, and you would have to play ball with her because she's doing that labor. Some of them wrote their own books that were respected and cited. We do have the remains of one written by Metrodora, and the only translation currently available in English is in your textbook, Medicine, Health, and Healing. Here we're looking at, we don't have her name, but this is a Medica. So this is a tombstone that was found in modern day France, Roman Gaul, where her portrait is on. Actually, I don't think this is her tombstone. I think this is her portrait on a building that she used her own money to pay for her city. She had enough money to endow a local building. Sometimes they would endow libraries or bathhouses or public theaters, like you name it. They could get wealthy enough that they could, maybe pay for a building at a university if such things existed. So if we were in ancient Rome, probably a Medica would have paid for the building we're in, maybe. Also, we see them sometimes listed as official physicians of a city, which is also a high rank mark. They would testify in legal cases. They would be consulted as experts. They didn't have to practice with the supervision of a male doctor. They practiced medicine, full stop. So my feeling, if you want to translate this word in the context of how the United States frames our specialties, this is an OBGYN. She's practicing independently. She doesn't need a more qualified supervisor. She can prescribe, she can treat, she can perform surgical procedures. She specializes in reproductive medicine, but she can also do general medicine on her existing patients there for reproductive care. We are talking about an OBGYN. So that's what I went with when I did the translations we'll be reading in OBGYN week. Also, I did the translations for your textbooks. So when you get to Cyrannus of Ephesus, that's me. I did those. One last note about my eye. We are looking here at part of a tomb in Ostia Antica. This is in Isla Sacra. It's part of the area where fancy people were buried. She, with her own money, paid for a tomb for herself, her mother, her husband, all of their freed people and enslaved people. It was one of the highest budget tombs in the necropolis. And necropolis is a city of the dead. It's a fancy word for a graveyard. This is on one side of the door as you're going into the tomb. On the other side is her husband, who was a surgeon. So she was an OBGYN, he was a surgeon, and their funeral portraits are them at work doing their job. Scribonia Attica is this lady right here. And then behind the patient is one of her assistants who's supporting the birthing patient. This is a birthing chair, and there our patient is having a baby. One of the interesting features of this tomb is the inscription, which ends in this puzzling, it's carved at the very end and it doesn't quite fit on the rock, so it was probably added later. So at the beginning, it's like, I, Scribonia Attica, with my own money, buy this tomb for my entire dang family, except for Paneritis and Prostokia. They do not get to be buried here. Now, we don't know what they did or allegedly did, but in this context, we know that from Roman legal documents that often doctors would enslave people to be their apprentices and then give them manumission but maintain the ability to call on them to help with their practice. So slavery is built into the way that medical practice was built in this period. We know that to be deliberately locked out of the tomb, Paneritis and Prostokia probably were not enslaved because presumably they're there and could expect to try to get into the tomb. Likely these are freed people. And there's this clause in Roman law that says if you're found to be an ungrateful freed person, you can be penalized in a variety of ways. The worst is being re-enslaved. But there are other things too that your former enslaver can continue to do to you after you've been manumitted. I think, therefore, it's likely that Paneritis and Prostokia were junior physicians who were trained within this practice, manumitted, and then didn't meet expectations. Expectations that my modern self would tend to think might have been a little unreasonable. And I hope wherever they are and wherever they ended up buried, Paneritis and Prostokia are living and thriving and surviving, because as much as Scribonia Attica is a great bit of evidence for what succeeding in medical practice looks like, I think we have to keep in mind she, in the tombstone, it's very specific, she is enslaving her people. She is also, therefore, I can't, even though it's normalized, it is an exploitative way to go about your labor practices. In this case, labor practices is also a horrible pun. I'll be here all week. Which is to say, Scribonia Attica, there are things to admire, but also we might have a toxic girl boss on our hands. So I fully raise an eyebrow at you, Scribonia. Scribonia, were you toxic? Maybe Paneritis and Prostokia were a problem, but I'm going to side with them in this very, very old argument. It's 2,000 years later. They can't hurt me. So next we're going to shift gears a little bit to talk more about dissection and cadavers in Roman medical history, because Galen, who is the topic of this discussion, part of why I spent so long on obstetrices in my eye is that you're going to see someone on prognosis. Galen treats a married lady, and he has to work with her supervising physician, who is a Maya. So we'll see how it actually goes quite well. He's like weirdly respectful to them, which I love for them because Galen, baby Galen. Okay. The other thing, though, that Galen wants us to know about him is that he is the best at knowing how anatomy works, that he has done the work and he has dissected everything and anything. In fact, the dissection manual that was the go-to how to dissect things manual up until the time of Vesalius in the 1500s was Galen's On Anatomical Procedures, which was his one-stop guide to how to dissect anything. And we mean like anything. At the beginning, he talks a bit about the one time he dissected an elephant. And then he also says, I really want to dissect a gnat, but I haven't figured out how, because they're tiny. But I'll explain the joke. So yeah, from what he writes, he does seem to have dissected a lot. He is quite authoritative, so authoritative that people in subsequent generations were a bit too convinced. So when what they were seeing in their own dissections didn't look like what Galen said would be there, they would struggle mightily with observation bias. And when Vesalius eventually does come out with his Galen was wrong expose in the 1500s, he was risking his professional reputation doing so because Galen was so darn convincing. However, for his time, Galen was a really well trained and self motivated dissector. And he talks a bit about where he gets not only his animal subjects for this dissection, which does seem to be what doctors are using most, but also his human subjects. We'll talk a bit about this gets more complicated, but for now, so you want to dissect a human. What are some acceptable targets for this? Again, according to Galen. So he mentions not himself, just people he knows doing the following from this list. Um, Actually, no, he has his own human skeletons. He's very careful to tell us that one of them was an alleged bandit that was left to rot on the side of the road, and the locals were like, "Yeah, sure, you can have the skeleton. We don't care. He's awful." And so Galen's like, "Yay, it's my skeleton." So he takes the skeleton. He gets his second skeleton when the river Tiber floods and busts through a couple of tombs as it erodes land away, and the skeleton floats out of the tomb, and they can't figure out who it is, and it's in the river, and Galen's like, "Well, you can't put it back now. I guess it's mine." But it goes to a lot of length to say it's just a skeleton. We'll come back to that in a minute. But then he mentions that some of his colleagues, not him, were given permission by the emperor to dissect dead Germans in the wake of a battle on the frontier. And he tells us this in order to then make fun of his colleagues for not knowing what they were looking at because they hadn't done enough time on their animal subjects. He's like, "You finally get a human and you're clueless because you didn't practice, you slackers." Galen, buddy, he also sounds a little jealous. I'm just going to say. He also mentions that dead people who died in the arena, so dead gladiator bodies, which Galen himself was treating gladiators, so, you know. And then also prisoners who were condemned as part of the criminal justice system would often, in order to maximize the return on their execution, they were executed as part of a public show. And then their bodies, because they were criminals, if their family didn't claim the body, that body was an unclaimed body and was considered fair game. We also mentioned the brigand that Galen gets a hold of. And then he mentions, most upsettingly, infants that have been abandoned and have either died or have died and then been abandoned. The sequence of events is unclear. Let us hope they died first. Probably not all of them, and that's really sad. But at any rate, he has a colleague who uses these unclaimed bodies as his anatomical research subjects, a pattern that we see repeated when human cadaver dissection becomes decriminalized and accepted in the 17 and 1800s in Europe. But we need to talk about this other category that Galen brings up that seems to be quite normalized in the ancient world, one that modern historians have labeled opportunistic vivisection. Let me explain what we mean by that. It's about as alarming as it sounds. So, this is solving a moral dilemma for our ancient anatomical researchers that if you cut somebody up while they're alive, that's malpractice. However, if you cut somebody up when they're dead and people see you doing it, they think you're creepy. So, also, there's no guarantee that a dead body looks like what the body looked like when it was alive, so your data might be bad. So, how do we solve this data problem and this human rights question mark problem? Well, they would say a better way to learn anatomy is when you've got somebody who's already got an injury and you're treating the injury anyway, why don't you just look around a little bit before you're done? Which sounds okay, except we're not washing our hands well. And also, pain control is not great for the patient. This falls into a category of medical research that historians now call medicalized torture. That is, when, under the guise of medical research, we cause pain and further harm to a living human in search of scientific data. It is not okay, and it happens a lot in medical history. And I'm trying to get all of this done on time, so I won't bring up examples, but they exist. We'll talk about one when we get to obstetrics and gynecology. So Galen, specifically mentions a few instances to give you an idea of what this looks like. They were victims of a thing he calls anthrax, but it's not anthrax as we know it today. It seems to be flesh eating strep, perhaps, where they have skin infections where the skin is being eaten away in the superficial tissues so you can see structures underneath. And he talks about how this was happening when he was in med school in Alexandria, and his professor would stand his med students up and have the patient like hold out their arm with the rodent ulcer live on it, and then be like, okay, patient, I'm going to ask you to wiggle your pinky. Med students, guess which bit of the open wound is going to twitch when the pinky gets wiggled. And then have the patient wiggle the pinky, and then all the doctors are like, oh. I wonder what the patients thought, and I hope they were okay and got away from that. It's not great. Then he also mentions patients in general with large wounds or ulcers. Uh, Even if they're going to die anyway, you can just sort of look while you're in there, which gives me a great deal of anxiety about the gladiators he was treating in Pergamon. Oh, yeah, and then wounded gladiators. He brings them up. So, yeah, I am concerned. So, for us, this seems like a really weird ethical choice. If your choice is between dead human and a live patient that we're poking around on while they're there, we might be like, clearly the cadaver is the better pick because they're already dead and they don't feel pain. However, the sourcing of and treatment of cadaver bodies in medical history is another rather disturbing bit of our shared scientific knowledge base that I think it's important to bring up. This next picture I'm showing with hesitation, but I think it's important to give you an idea of what medical students were being encouraged to do in medical schools of the early 1900s. Part of this was in an effort to get doctors to overcome or minimize their own emotional responses to the suffering they see in their patients by dehumanizing and separating from the body of the cadaver that they're assigned as part of their anatomical training, which led to med students thinking it was okay to pose with their cadaver in a humorous tableau like this one. Not okay. I am so sorry, buddy. But that it could get worse. There was also a serial killer ring, Burke and Hare, in Edinburgh in the 1800s, who, to get the freshest cadavers possible, started murdering people and then selling the bodies to the medical school. Not good. So we have the system we have in part to put patient consent back into our sourcing of cadaver bodies, but it is something that as a field, medicine is now having a reckoning with. Like how, when we have other ways of teaching anatomy, how ethical is it to use a whole body for just a medical student to learn anatomy on? And how useful is it to learn on a dead body, which again is not going to behave like a live body? So it is a question we are asking. Another here more ancient medical ethic, although having once been treated in a teaching hospital, I have some sympathy with this, although I love med students. I like students. It makes me feel like less of a patient when I have students in the room. I'm weird, I know. So this is the poem in Latin, and here it is in English. And this is a a poet who is not a doctor and probably doesn't know many unless he's hiring one. But he's writing about this experience he has where I was ill, but you came immediately to me, Symmachus, a Greek name. That's the doctor. Accompanied by 100 students, 100 hands frozen by the north wind touched me. I didn't have the fever, Symmachus, but now I do. If you bring your med students with you, and in the educational system of antiquity, almost every physician is going to be followed by their own personal med student ducklings into the patient's room. And your patient becomes an unwitting subject for med students to learn on. And in this ancient medical culture, the less powerful you are, the less you can do to refuse contact with med students, the more exposure this sick person has to a lot of other people touching him that don't necessarily need to be there. This is still an ethical issue when we're talking about medical education. When is it okay to use patients to train med students? When is it not okay? How do we balance the need of doctors to learn with the rights of patients to feel private and safe and not be woken up 50 times in the middle of the night? It is something that we have not yet solved and are continuing to do so, and something that if you go to med school or nursing school or any kind of school where you have to learn how to do patients, you'll encounter it early, and it'll be something that you'll have to learn to navigate. The med student's dilemma hasn't quite been solved, but it's definitely a part of what's going on in ancient practice. So here we're looking at the floor plan of the House of the Surgeon in Pompeii, which we've named because we found a bunch of medical instruments in this very nice urban villa. It's a wealthy person house, but it's unusual in that there's a shop front and then all of these little rooms in the public front area of the house, the private bit where people live and work. Oh, sorry, my mouse isn't showing. Private bit here, everything from here south, so the tablinum towards the entrance is a quasi-public area of the house. In these rooms marked bedrooms, not exactly beds because we found more medical instruments in here. This is a house that had to be evacuated quickly along with every other house on the block and in the city because a volcano was erupting. And if you didn't get out in time, the volcano would eat you. And it did eat some people, but folks had to leave their medical instruments and run, lucky for us, because we found an array of medical instruments in most of these rooms, and some of them were clustered around different specialties. One did seem to be in OBGYN's room, which is nifty. One of our best Roman obstetrical speculums, which you'll see on the next slide. I'll have you pick it up out of a lineup. We found in here. And then this seems to have been a consultation area and shop front. So this isn't quite a hospital, it's more like a clinic, but fixed clinic locations with a group practice are a thing that could happen. Almost certainly this was a family dwelling as well, so it is possible that members of this group practice were also either enslaved, formerly enslaved, as well as the owners of the house/practice, which is a wild working situation to think about. And if you're anywhere near a medical practice and are feeling mentally healthy, imagine your supervising physician owns you. I hope that's not the case. And if it is, like, let me know and I'll try to find you legal help, because no. Anyway, here are some of the medical instruments we found. Can anyone spot the speculum? Yes.
Is it top row, fourth from the left?
Top row, fourth from the left. No. So this is the uvula and tonsil forceps. You used to clamp the back of the throat. No, bigger. Oh, yes. That. So you turn this screw mechanism at the bottom, and this pushes the bar upwards, which extends the four prongs evenly outwards to dilate the orifice that they've been inserted into. These prongs extend this way. The whole thing's made out of bronze, and it requires quite a lot of hand skill. On either end, there are images of lions on this one, I think. We found another one with Egyptian themes, and there were some other Egypt coded objects in that room, so we think that we might have been in an Egyptian immigrant community practicing medicine. Not this one, though. This one is a little bit plainer. This is not the one that you get if you're coming in for a regular pelvic exam. This would be used when you're performing surgery on the cervix or uterus, or when you're managing a difficult delivery of a baby. I don't know if that makes it better, but it is quite the business-like item, isn't it? These rounded edges are rounded so that even when it's closed, you can still fit your entire hand through.
So how large is it, like measurement wise?
It is about like this full thing. The bit that inserts vaginally or rectally, you could use this as a rectal speculum as well, is sized very comparably to a modern one, in part because it's sized to fit the area. The whole thing together is quite the bit of hardware. And we found others of this type. We also do find things that look a lot more like what you're used to in a speculum, where it's just got the two valves or prongs, only instead of opening like a duckbill this way, instead they open side to side, and it's just a clamp, like a pair of pliers mechanism. We'll see more of them when we get to surgery, and I do have a working model that you can examine. Okay, so my last story is the one I'm going to leave you with in the 2 minutes remaining to us. And this is a comment on one of the stories in Galen's On Prognosis that might be a little bit of a head scratcher. This is where he diagnoses a raging case of the love. What, you may ask? Love was thought to be possibly pathological if you experienced too much of it. They felt that it could kill you if left untreated, particularly if it was a hopeless sexual attraction to somebody who was inappropriate and you weren't able to access for whatever reason. So part of Galen's trick, where he outs the person involved, he's taking a pulse, and when the alleged crush walks into the room, he notices that the pulse starts jumping. He's like, "Ha ha! You have the love." In other versions of the story, because other doctors told this story, it seems to be a perfectly okay story to tell about you and your patients. It was felt to be a difficult diagnosis to make. So if you could diagnose a case of the loves, you were showing that you were such a good doctor. But in some versions of this, the inappropriate crush ends up dead, exiled. It doesn't really end well. And it's normally an upper class woman who's having feelings for someone who is enslaved or socially inferior or not their husband. Often the doctor leaves the room and then we never find out what awkwardness ensues. But I'm still very concerned about everybody involved. And maybe Galen was wrong, which makes it even worse. But nonetheless, if you experienced a crush in ancient Rome, you might end up fearing for your life. So, I hope that doesn't happen to you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I'm going to have exercises for us to do in class on Wednesday. So do work your way through On Prognosis. You'll need it for later. Take care, guys.
You too, thank you.
You too, as well. You are welcome.
Good night.
Ciao. Welcome back, Al.
Have a good day, Professor.
You too. Take care. Let's turn that up. And
You might still be able to